Back in the time of the Great War, massive land battleships like the British Mark IV and the German A-7V dominated the battlefield, basically as giant machine gun emplacements. Sure, they took like 40 people to man, but when you have 5 machine guns, who cares, right? Nobody's going to tell you how to build your tank with 5 machine guns in their face, now will they? Anyways, back to what I was saying. After the Great War, people continued with this idea of land battleships, with war strategists reshaping the theoretical battlefields of the future to revolve around these great beasts of war. That is, until the Germans decided that big slow tanks were dumb. Cue the Blitzkrieg, with relatively small, well-armed, and fast tanks advancing quickly en masse, and devastating most of Eastern Europe into France in a matter of months. As the Allied powers began to fight back, they too had new, revolutionary tanks to field and challenge these new panzers. The Americans with their legendary M4 Shermans, the USSR with the ubiquitous T-34, and the British with... Oh, come on, really? Did the tank designers take any tips from literally anyone around them? I thought we were done with the land battleships. Okay, France, you don't count. Yes, as you've probably guessed by now, today we'll be building a 1/48 scale Tamiya Churchill Crocodile. And just to add my own twist to it, we'll add a lot of details to it, including weld seams, cast texture, scratch-built parts, and a lot of 3D printed stuff. But before we get into all that fun stuff, we gotta exercise our basic modeling skills, i.e. cutting out parts, sanding seam lines, and gluing plastic together. And let me just say right now, this is probably the best kit I've ever had the pleasure of constructing. The whole trope about Tamiya engineering and excellent fit, yeah, that's 100% true, and if you want an easy, stress-free, and fun build, I can highly recommend this kit. This kit, like most of the Tamiya 1/48 series, comes with little metal weights, which are a little gimmicky in my opinion, but the weight of the model is pretty cool at the same time. I'd say my only critique of this kit, and it's my usual critique of Tamiya, is that the details are a bit, shall we say, understated. All the grab handles and some of the Pioneer tools are molded into the upper hull. Thankfully, for a tiny 1/48 scale kit like this, I think it's alright. We will be replacing and enhancing some of the details, but don't worry too much about these ones. Anyways, let's start off with some basic armor texturing. I really was interested in this really thick front plate, since based on references there's a ton of neat and unique textures on it. I started by shaving down an angle on the top plate, where the front plate meets the hull roof, if you will, which makes a good space for a weld seam down the road. I also added some deep scoring to the plate, as this is something I observed in the texture. It has these really large scars in the armor, and I'm not sure why, but it looks really neat, and so I wanted to incorporate it. I also made sure to make it go deeper than the real thing, since we're adding more texture over it and I don't want to lose them. After I added these scars to the armor plates, I stippled on a layer of Tamiya putty thinned with extra thin cement. This is pretty easy to do, and the only thing you really need to worry about is putting it in the wrong spots. As you can see, I avoided certain components based on their composition, as well as a little artistic interpretation. This usually takes a couple layers to achieve the proper effect. Once that's all applied, I just sanded down the surface gently to soften the texture and remove any sharp peaks or aggressive textures. Pretty simple. The next part's not so simple, and to caveat this, I'm really bad at it. Yes, I've watched Martin's videos on it and I've practiced a good amount, I could just never seem to get the epoxy to do exactly what I want to. By the end of this tank, however, I will say that I was getting noticeably better and more comfortable with it. Anyways, there are a ton of weld seams on this vehicle. Like almost everything you can think of was welded on, with those really large, fairly nasty welds. The Soviets are generally known for their bad welds, but this was honestly a close second, so I wasn't too worried about the quality. I'm sure that most of you guys know how it works by now, but if you mix up 2-part epoxy putty, I like Tamiya Quick Type, a lot of people prefer green stuff, so I may try that out. Whatever you do, just don't use Milliput. That stuff is horrible. After that, you roll it into really small and thin noodles between 2 sheets of styrene, and roll those noodles into gaps, corners, and edges, basically wherever you want the weld seam. Try to fill the gap as consistently as possible, since it makes the next step a lot easier. Also, a little tip, while you're working with this stuff, make sure to wet the toothpick you're using to pick it up and manipulate the putty with. The putty will stick to that better than the model if you don't. There are a bunch of different tools you can use to shape the weld after this. For this kind of weld, which is like a bunch of dimes stacked on top of each other, also generally known as a single bevel groove weld, I'm going to use a piece of photo etch sheet folded into a U shape. Then I'm going to impress that shape into the putty over and over again until we get a row of C's going down the length of the weld. Alright, once that's done, for now, I'm going to start these link and length tracks. Generally, I prefer 3D printed tracks, but to be honest, these did great for the Churchill. The upper run is hidden below the fenders, and the visible runs are flawless and look super realistic. Just make sure you follow the instructions closely, as a missing or extra link can ruin your day. Also, I'd recommend using a relatively slow drying glue to make sure you have the tracks where they need to be before the cement sets. Okay, so now we can button this up and start working on the sides of the track. Are these sponsons? Skirts? I'm not sure. Regardless, I started by texturing this section of the armor, as I saw some really heavy textures in here in references and wanted to take full advantage of that. I also added welds and all the rest. As you can see, the second weld was a different style since it was made up of multiple linear passes with the welding gun. I sanded down a section of sprue into a long sharp edge to achieve this shape. You know, I think I have an idea for the next weld project. My Patreons may actually already know about it, as they're generally about a week or two ahead on channel stuff. In fact, this video has been available to them for about a week now, ad-free. If you want to join them, check it out below. Okay, so back to the build. I really do not like the tow cable supplied in the kit. They're super stiff and unnatural, as they're completely molded as one piece. We're going to try to fix this problem. First off, the cable has a little bracket that helps guide it back. This was completely missing in the kit, so I designed and 3D printed one. It was pretty simple and probably could have been done with sheet metal, but I'm definitely not as good at scratch building as I am with 3D modeling. I also 3D printed new eyelets, which fit a 0.8mm braided copper cable, which I had just lying around. As you can see, this is so much more realistic, and I think it'll really be a fun detail to paint and weather. The biggest benefit to changing this part out with a copper wire was that we could make it super droopy and realistic looking over this track guard here, because in reality it wasn't that nice S shape that you see in the kit part. It was much more droopy and uneven and irregular, and the copper wire replicated this perfectly. Let's add some more detail to the surface, and this was a pretty easy one, but I replaced the flamethrower barrel with the dispenser needle. For those who don't know, dispenser needles are just hypodermic needles without the cutting edge ground in. They're pretty cheap and easy to get your hands on. The exhaust was the most scratch building that I think I've ever attempted, and to be fair, it's not a ton, but it's a start. To start, I didn't really like the exhaust ends, so I replaced them with some styrene stock. It's not the best thing ever, but I think they're totally serviceable. I also textured the muffler just to start the rust effects on that puppy early. Also, one of my favorite parts for this build, I decided to replace the exhaust shielding with brass sheeting. Thankfully, it's just 3 folds and it looks really good. I also added some photo etch bolts afterwards, but I forgot to film that part. A big benefit to having replaced these is I can dent them up, as I think that while troops are moving around on the top of the thing and crew is moving ammo in and out, boxes are going to land on this, it's going to dent it, it's going to damage it, and that's what the photo references show as well. This might be a little overstated, but it helps with our own weathering, because the more detail we have, the easier it is to weather the model. And I couldn't help myself and added what looks like marking lights on the fenders. I understand why these were missing in the kit because they're absolutely tiny, but I have a 3D printer and I can add them. Oh, and I added some little 0.2mm wires to wire them up. And there we go. The hull is done. I am really excited for how this kit is already coming together, and it's going to get so much better from here. Okay, turret's up next. On a modern tank, the turret would be almost as complicated as the hull, but thankfully this is a World War II tank, so the turret is nice and simple. And on top of that, there are some really awesome textures we can add to it. So, like the rest, let's start with some texture. On this section, I wanted to add some really deep marks to the hull armor, as again, that's what I saw in references. This time, however, I took my ball burr on my Dremel and carved them out this way. It worked surprisingly well and was super efficient. Just make sure that you're recreating this to keep your Dremel on the lowest setting to avoid melting the plastic. Turns out that this really didn't work as well as I wanted, and nothing ended up being visible after everything else was added. Then again, there isn't paint on it yet, so maybe the paint will help bring out those textures. This was followed by stippling on a layer of pure extra thin cement straight out of the bottle. This will help get some really rough texture going and will serve as a base for the next few effects. There's really not a ton to say here, all it is stippling the surface with a brush until you've achieved the look you want. And we'll follow that up with the same diluted putty mix, and also a little bit of undiluted putty for some extra roughness. On a 1/48 scale kit, you really got to worry about over texturing it though, so make sure to keep the undiluted putty to a minimum. Something that I learned while doing this project, especially this texturing part, is that a lot of the textures I was making are actually a little understated compared to what I was expecting them to be on the final product. And so on the next project, I might actually go a little bit overboard with them and see how that looks. We're also going to have to put paint on this to see the final result, but I'm not 100% sure that I got the dramatic look that I wanted to. The weld seam along the upper edge of the turret is super prominent on real tanks, so I decided to retexture it as well. Carving away the old one was a little daunting, just because of the angles, so I tried doing it with a ball burr on my Dremel, and that did the trick nicely. Just make sure that the ball burr is small enough that it'll fit into that weld seam and not destroy extra around it. Then we could fill the seam with epoxy and add the weld pattern. From references, this seems to have a multiple pass weld. If sculpting all these welds seems daunting to you, I'm working on a product right now to help with that. I'll most likely reveal it on the next project, but we'll see. Maybe it'll be on the Instagram page first. I like then using a wet brush to smoothen down the weld seams because sometimes they can get a little bit sharp and you want them to be slightly rounded. And so having a wet brush and just gently brushing it over the surface actually helps make the effect more subtle. And quick break from the turret, but I forgot about these photo etch wing nuts I have, and they fit perfectly with the tool clamps on the Pioneer tools on the back deck, so I added those real quick. I had some spare grab handles from the Striker build, and so I decided to replace the small ones on the turret cheeks with them. It's a small improvement, but I think it adds a lot. This little detail is going to help out 100% on the future effects I have planned. Then we'll add some custom 3D details to the top, since the original antenna mount was garbage and the gun sight was non-existent. These files are available on my Patreon, and also for sale on Colts 3D for your own projects. And finally for the turret, I saw this really cool trick where you carve the lettering off the sprues and glue it to the model. This is awesome for replicating cast numbers if you don't have the fancy Archer 3D decals or anything. And then I covered these over with some diluted putty to finish the effect and tie them in. And with that, we can call the turret finished. I am so happy with how this turned out. Each little part of this tank feels like a mini model in and of itself, and it's kept the build really fresh and kept me excited all the way through the build process. Okay, finally on to the trailer. I started with the wheels, which on their own would look totally fine, but I like to represent this kind of thing in a more worn down, beaten up condition, since we're going to be doing some really heavy weathering on this puppy, and this will help the model look more cohesive. So here's what I did. I started by taking an X-Acto knife and gouged out chunks of the tire pattern. This will serve as the first layer of damage to the tire. I did a combination of sticking the tip of the blade in and twisting out pieces of plastic, and also just cutting small chips out of the tread. After that, I wanted to make more scratches and scoring into the tire, and I used a wire wheel on my Dremel for that and had a ton of scratches and gouges in the surface. We can then smooth out the surface a bit with extra thin cement. And this is the final result. I think it's going to look really good once we get it painted up. The rest of the trailer was pretty basic. There's not a ton of detail to it, but I did add some wire grab handles to the hatches on this thing, since there are bricks of plastic on the original kit parts. This is a super easy mod to do at home to any kit, and if you have to make multiples, just try to have a reference in your pliers or bending tool so they stay consistent. As you can see, I have a depth reference for each handle too, basically just the thickness of my tweezers. Okay, next let's take a look at the trailer through the lens of its original construction methods. How exactly were these towing eyes attached? Looking at these things, they were most likely either cast or machined out of one part and then welded in the surface. So that's exactly what we're going to do on our model. Oh, and we'll also add a super subtle texture to the spare propellant canisters just to distinguish them from the rest of the trailer. I know this isn't super accurate, but stylistically I think it'll add a lot after some paint. And that's it, that's the trailer, and the main construction finished. And this would be the point where I usually close the video and get right to painting. But not today. I was having so much fun with this project, and I saw so many of these vehicles just covered in stowage that I decided to add some stowage to this model. The first thing I wanted to do was add track armor to the front. I couldn't find any spare Churchill track files online, but what's funny is that the M4 Sherman tracks were almost more common in the references I saw. So we're going to recreate this picture here with the track dropped over the glasses plate. I also took some liberties and added some more tracks to the front plate as more applique armor. Another picture revealed some flimsy cans and a bucket hanging from the back plate, which I recreated with a little twisted wire and some of Martin Kovac's flimsy can files. I couldn't get the handle to properly print, and so I replaced them with a bit of bent brass sheeting from a photo etch set. This may actually be my favorite detail in the entire kit, to be honest. This was a lot more difficult than I was expecting. There's just so many options for how to arrange it and make it look realistic, but it feels like it doesn't look super realistic until the stowage arrangement is basically done. All I would say is spend some time familiarizing yourself with period correct containers and equipment, as well as many reference photos of the vehicle or similar vehicles as possible. To be perfectly honest, I completely copied parts of the stowage layout from certain photos, like the tracks, the specific fuel can placement on the trailer, and more. Something you can probably tell is I really struggled with the tarps on this kit, but VMS Paper Shaper came to the rescue for sure on this one. It's a custom type of paper, feels very much like origami paper with a little more structure. And you add a little water-based glue stuff that they make to solidify everything down. Super easy to use and make someone who sucks at working with epoxy putty, like me, into a tarp ninja. Finally, everything's got to be lashed down like in real life so it doesn't fall off the vehicle. So we're going to do the same thing here. This is just really thin wire that I stripped from a small DC motor and then twisted together to make a small 2-strand rope. I'm really happy with how it looks, and for this scale it looks pretty darn realistic too. Almost forgot about the turret. I hung a few field bags and British helmets from the turret, really focusing on how this would be done in real life and making sure that everything looked realistic. As such, the bags are all strung up on a wire that I ran from the cheek handles to the rear stowage box, and I hung the field bags with brass photo etch strips. And that's it. This kit is finished, and to be perfectly honest, this is one of my favorite kits of all time, and I'm so happy with how it came out. I'm really stoked to paint this thing, and next week I think we'll base coat everything and try to get some extreme shading, more than's usual for this channel. To be honest, I didn't love the color modulation on the T14, so we're going to try a slightly different technique. And before we close out, let me just extend a huge thank you to my Patreon supporters. You guys are awesome and you're the key to keep this channel growing and pumping out videos. If you want to join them, check out the link below and choose from a bunch of cool perks like early access ad-free videos, benchtop updates, 3D files like the one you saw in this video, and more. If you enjoyed the video, the best way to support me, that's absolutely free, is to hit that subscribe button to keep this channel growing. Anyways, I've got some painting to do, so thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.